This is Risky Women Radio, a show to connect, celebrate, and champion women in risk, regulation, and compliance, sharing insight and perspective from the most influential members of our global Risky Women network on the latest developments we need to think about, the challenges we should all talk more about, and the innovation we are most excited about in governance, risk, and compliance. Bringing together the hundreds of senior women professionals already connected with a new emerging group of leading women and men. I'm Kimberly Cole, your Chief Risky Woman. Hi, we're always looking for sponsors, and if you'd like to get involved and help celebrate and champion women in risk regulation and compliance, please get in contact at info@riskywomen.org. We'd love to have you join the show. Welcome to Risky Women Radio. I have been wanting to have Pru Bennett join us on Risky Women Radio for some time, so I was thrilled that we finally got our schedules to align and she joins us here today. We did have a great live event, which we've had to postpone, but like everyone else, we've managed to adapt and move our formats, and so here we are speaking via Zoom, and I think you are going to really enjoy this episode. I met Pru many years ago now in Hong Kong, and my initial interaction was a keynote that she delivered at the Women's Foundation on a report that Pru had authored on diversity on boards. Since then, I have learnt so much from Pru on governance and its impact, and some really great ideas on how companies need to sort of shift and change their focus. Pru Bennett is a seasoned corporate governance leader who is now sharing her vast experience as a senior advisor amongst many other leadership and advisory roles that she holds. She spent the bulk of her career at BlackRock as a leading director in governance, and Pru actively participates in public debates on corporate governance and stewardship. She received the Asia Industry Leadership Award from the 100 Women in Finance, as well as being listed as Australia's top 10 women of influence in corporate governance. She's known as a champion for diversity and inclusion, having published numerous papers on diversity in boards, as well as steering the Women's Foundation Hong Kong's 30% Club, which is focused on boosting the number of women on boards and in senior management. I hope you enjoy this episode, which kicks off Season 3 of Risky Women Radio. Thanks for listening. Welcome to Risky Women Radio. Today's Risky Woman is Pru Bennett. Welcome, Pru, to Risky Women Radio.
Well, thank you for having me, Kimberly.
It's a pleasure. Now, we always kick off and try to understand a bit more about the sort of career journey of our risky women, which is always fascinating. So you've been focused on governance, and tell us more about your journey today.
Well, I always describe my career as being very serendipitous. I started as a chartered accountant, went through that pathway, and ended up with Qantas as investor relations. It was a very good opportunity because it was when Qantas went from being privately owned or government owned to listing on the stock exchange. But it was also at a time when I really experienced gender discrimination, being female and also being female with children, and the opportunities. I wasn't getting the opportunities that others were that weren't in my situation. But it was at that time I came across a proxy advisory firm that was advising institutional shareholders of how to vote at Qantas's annual general meeting. And it was very different from the analyst reports that I had been reviewing over the previous sort of 1 or 2 years. And I was quite interested and started a conversation, and I asked if I could join their firm. So I then made it quite clear to them that I had 2 small children, that I wanted to work part-time, earn a certain level of income, and that if my children were sick, I didn't come in and I wasn't to be questioned, which was a real problem from where I was. And they said, yep, no problems. I joined that firm in 1997. In 1998, when I was actually pregnant with my 3rd child, I was offered a directorship and also took over as CEO, and I ran that business for 12 years, and then we were bought out by Glass Lewis. And it was at the time when executive compensation wasn't an issue, climate change wasn't an issue. So I've been very fortunate to be on that real journey in ESG from the very, very beginning. But as I said before, it's very serendipitous as how I ended up there, and there was no science to it or deep thought about planning it.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. And I mean, you mentioned ESG there, and obviously I spoke about, sort of your focus on the G and that, the governance. can you tell us, Risky Women, a bit more detail about what's the importance of the governance role and sort of maybe a bit more details around sort of what elements it covers?
The G is the most important, and that acronym ESG is sort of developed in the mid-2000s, and I remember seeing it and saying, why is the G at the end? And the G, when it comes to the board, is critical. And it's around having a board that's comprised of competent people. And I know all the guidelines talk about majority of independent, but it's not just about having independent directors. It's about having competent directors. It's around having diversity of thought around the board table. It's around having core industry skills amongst the independent directors. To have oversight of management. And so those directors are there of listed companies really representing the shareholders and investors. And it's that oversight they have of management to be able to challenge management on various issues and have that collective knowledge, skills and experience to be able to do that. And I always talk about looking at E&S through the G lens. So if you've got a competent board, the right skills and experience, whatever a company is exposed to from an E&S risk is going to be managed better than a board that is not competent and doesn't ask those questions of management and doesn't understand what the company is exposed to from an E&S perspective.
Very interesting. So given that you said your sort of career journey was very serendipitous, but what do you think was the biggest risk that you've taken in your career?
I think probably the biggest risk I've taken was retiring from BlackRock. I gave 12 months' notice. It was a fabulous role, but relocating to Sydney to be back with our 3 children was a priority. So now I'm working for myself. So that's been a bit of a risk to take, to go from working for a very large organisation, a secure organisation, to be now in charge of my own destiny for the next few years at least.
Interesting too. And so, I mean, obviously then lots of career choices you've made along the way, including this most recent one. And what were some of the motivations I guess you said it was serendipitous, but what kind of thinking happened along the way when you were making your career choices?
Well, it was very serendipitous up until, I got into governance. And what I found out about governance is that you're in a position to make a difference. So at Corporate Governance International, CGI, we were making recommendations to our clients about how to vote at shareholder meetings. And initially, institutional investors didn't vote. We did research to identify this that was published that put pressure on institutional investors to vote. We then had asset owners as clients who were pushing their managers to vote. And so I felt that our firm really had an influence in increasing voting, making issues such as composition, succession planning, executive remuneration, bringing them to the forefront, because this really mattered to long-term value creation for companies listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. And likewise with my stewardship role at BlackRock, with the engagement that I was able to do with companies is making a difference for our clients. And so that was always the question I would ask in any decisions to change roles. And that's been a common theme since I got into corporate governance work.
And what are the lessons that you think you've kind of learned along the way, and how you've sort of adapted and moved as you've learned things?
Keeping an open mind and looking out for unintended consequences. Governance can be seen very much as a tick-the-box approach. And there were many companies that didn't tick all the boxes. So did that mean we should just recommend against the re-election of certain directors? And so, again, stepping back, having a look at the company and the circumstances and keeping that open mind. I think a really good example of that is I was at a conference and the speaker was talking about child labour. A company in Brazil was accused of using child labour in agricultural work, and the investor said, "Oh, well, we're getting rid of our investment in that because we don't support companies that have child labour." The company stopped it. The alternative for the girls, and it was mainly girls at around age 12, to earn income was prostitution. So while it looks very good and well-meaning that we don't invest in companies that use child labour, the unintended consequence of that decision was absolutely dire for those workers. So keeping an open mind, looking out for unintended consequences, and not taking that tick-the-box approach, I think is what I've really learned.
I think that's fantastic advice, and exactly right on the sort of child labour, slave labour, is that making people more vulnerable increases the implications and the risk for that behaviour. So yeah, fantastic points. And sort of slightly change of tack here, but who are some of the role models that you've been inspired by?
I think Sandy Easterbrook, who was one of the original founders of Corporate Governance International, has really been a role model for me, and I've just attended Sandy's 80th birthday last Sunday. Sandy has a fantastic legal mind. He's a former partner at Mallison's, and he took the time to sit down and really explain to me, how governance worked and how important. Now, he used to use the expression that corporate governance isn't rocket science, and it's not. When you're talking about getting the right people, right mix of skills on the board, core industry skills, it just makes sense. And he just had a really considered way of looking at issues. And another person that has really inspired me is Mervyn King. He is the founder of Integrated Reporting, and he's just got an extraordinary mind when he talks about the corporation being an incapacitated person, the role of the board as stewards to hand on the state of the company to the next board in as good and preferably better condition that they got it in. And there's one other person, and that's Geraldine Buckingham, which is amazing because she's 20 years younger than me, and to then have someone that I aspire to who's significantly younger. But she's now chairman of Asia Pacific for BlackRock, based in Hong Kong. And what I learned from her was around managing a team and partnering with your direct reports and your team to help them progress in their careers, and your responsibility as a leader to partner with your people. And I followed her advice, and from my team, and I had a fabulous team in Hong Kong, I really got a lot out of them, or that, their contribution just totally changed. And I had a real diverse team from a very large team in Japan, in Singapore, and in Australia, and obviously Hong Kong. And being able to do that partnership was just a game changer for me in team management.
That's super advice there, and obviously some fabulous role models to learn and be guided by. But I think that's good guidance for all of us. So you mentioned there, the focus of boards. I'd like to get your expert opinion now on the focus on boards and really dig into maybe some of the purpose. We've mentioned ESG is now a hot topic, or environment, social and governance. So in your view, is the focus on all of these elements at the correct level and at the correct focus, especially at both the board and maybe the executive level as well?
It is changing, and it depends in the world where you are. The G will always be the most important. And I think with the environmental and social side, what is happening and what has happened to the valuation of companies over the years, that it has changed quite significantly. There's research shows that in 1975, the average S&P company, 75% of market cap was made up of physical and financial assets, 25% was intangible. Now that's completely reversed. By 2016, it's 85% intangible, and that's the E and the S. And that's where the value creation and potential value loss can be made in a company. So while the G still remains just as important, the value of the E and S, when you're talking about market cap, has changed significantly. And I'm not convinced that boards and management have really acknowledged that shift in value and have changed their thinking and their decision-making processes that align with that shift in value.
Interesting. So what questions should boards be asking?
It's a good question, because I think that should change a lot compared to, say, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. And the way I look at it is, yesterday's board was asking the question, what money are we making? Today's board should be asking the questions, how are we making our money? What are our externalities? What's our footprint on society? And how can we minimise our externality? And another yesterday's question would be, how do we best serve our shareholders? Where today's question is, what is our purpose? What are our values and principles? And how vulnerable is our social licence to operate? But other questions that boards should be asking themselves should be along the lines of, do we have true diversity of thought? And I think this is a question that is starting to be asked more and more, but if you go back 20 years ago, that wasn't even on the table. Are we getting the right information? And that's around that shift in valuation about, I'm convinced that, and based on my discussions, that most boards are still focused on that physical and financial aspects, and the information is all around the physical and financial aspects of the company and not around where the value is, which is 85%. And boards should be asking whether they really understand their conflicts of interests. And that comes to the topic of executive compensation, because most boards receive their advice around executive compensation from management. So that's a huge conflict. And again, based on my discussions with directors, I'm not convinced most of them really understand managing that conflict of interest. Stakeholders, do boards really understand who their stakeholders are these days? And that has changed. And whether or not boards are meeting their stakeholder needs. I think boards also should be asking questions around the level of trust also internally and externally. And we've seen with the Banking Royal Commission what happened with the level of trust for Australian banks. And once that trust is lost, it can take years to build that up. So it's much better off for boards to be in a position where they don't lose that trust and maintain that trust, but are they getting the information about it, and do they really understand where they are in terms of the community and also their own internal stakeholders of where they are with trust? And does the board really understand the true costs of how the returns are generated, or are they simply focused on those costs that are itemised in the P&L? And a good example of that is staff turnover. Staff turnover is a huge cost on businesses. But when you look at the P&L, there's no line item staff turnover cost, because it's reflected through all those other costs, those other line items. And also boards should be asking themselves, where are they vulnerable? And I think the whole COVID-19 issue has just raised vulnerabilities with boards. Yes, they've had business continuity plans. They've sort of tested every 6 or 3 months, but now they've got to be implemented. And I'm not sure that the boards were really ready for this. And again, that comes down to crisis management. Do they have the right resilient directors on the board for a situation like this? You can't have directors that can't face up to these challenges.
Yeah, incredibly complex. Lots of questions, as you say, that boards should be asking. And I think, as you said there, the social license to operate, the trust and that true cost element, and how they map that out and how they actually, that goes from top down through the organisation is incredibly important.
Yeah.
And how are you seeing that the best companies measure and tackle some of those issues around ESG?
Transparency is the key, and also ESG disclosure and management is an evolving issue, and seeing that change as I think management becomes more aware of it, management and boards become more comfortable with their disclosures. And I think climate change disclosure is a very good example of this. And I'm working with a client at the moment who's really struggling with how much to disclose and how to disclose issues without making them vulnerable. And greenwashing can be just so obvious with some of the disclosures that you see. And from an investor perspective, investors can only make their judgments and come to conclusions based on public disclosures. But boards and in particular the CEO taking a position on certain issues and the leadership position as opposed to just following what peers do, I think identifies a good board from a listed company board.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of understand a bit more about that as well. 'Cause, I mean, what do you think are the characteristics of a high-performing board? You know, you've spoken to many boards of directors, many management teams, and so what are those attributes that you think the board directors also need to hold to effectively deliver their duty?
The board as a whole has to have the right collection and diversity of skills. So that's put sort of a starting point. But each of those individuals needs to have intellectual honesty, and they need to be able to ask the hard questions of management and of themselves. And they also need to be able to identify where they may lack expertise in a particular topic, cybersecurity being one and climate change being another. Now, investors don't expect to see a cybersecurity expert on every board. It's just, one, it's not possible, there wouldn't be enough people, and two, a good cybersecurity expert doesn't necessarily make a good director. But boards should be able to have that intellectual honesty to go and seek independent advice on certain topics so that they can challenge management in a constructive way and in an informed way, as opposed to just hiding behind the issue and not asking any questions. And directors with that intellectual honesty, I think, are few and far between. It's unfortunate, but being able, as I said, being able to identify when you don't have the knowledge and skills in a particular area, to be able to ask informed questions of management and then putting your hand up saying, I need to get some independent expert advice, getting that advice and bringing it back into the boardroom is extremely important.
Yes, independent expert advice, and I also like your intellectual honesty as key attribute. So that's very true. What are the key focus areas for you currently? And I guess we would have just had a pretty rapid shift on what some of those focus areas are. But thinking, before COVID-19, what was the sort of agenda that you saw for the 2020 focus for companies? And obviously there's been some pretty dramatic changes in that agenda.
I think climate change is the number one issue for companies, whether the company is in an industry that is significantly exposed to climate change risk, such as oil and gas and extractive industries, as opposed to, say, financial services companies. Boards need to take a position on this issue. They need to articulate that to shareholders, investors and other stakeholders, and determine how they're going to disclose, in particular, issues around scenario analysis and their long-term strategy. Because while the long-term strategy might be determined today, within the next couple of years there will be technology changes that will impact that. And so it is an absolute journey around climate change. But to be aware and know about being or make a minimum commitment to be net zero by 2050, if not before that, and I've just been working on some research this morning that I'd say there's an increasing number of companies that are bringing that date forward, and not be scared to make those ambitious commitments. And I think that comes back to another attribute of a director is to have courage, but they do need to be able to make informed decisions on these issues.
Yeah, I think we should we could do another podcast on tackling or trying to tackle that issue and how people should be acting. But I think climate change remains top of the agenda, as you say. And how does the tone at the top frame some of that discussion? I guess it's talked about a lot. It's an area of discussion, regulator focus, and given the number of corporate scandals and misconduct, how are companies and boards ensure that they understand and that they can influence that tone at the top?
All companies should have a stated purpose, values and principles, and whatever decisions are made, those purpose, values and principles should be part of that. And so in any decision, it's not a case of, or can we, because you probably can, it should be, and is this aligned with the company's purpose, values and principles? An example where that wasn't a case was VW, and I think it was about 2010, 2011. Volkswagen's purpose was to manufacture the most number of cars. They lacked values and they lacked principles. So yes, they ticked that box. They became the biggest, the manufacturer of most number of cars globally. But we know what happened to Volkswagen. We know the loss of value. We know the loss of trust, and that's because that it was missing the values and the principles, which are just so important, and they have to be lived and breathed and walked and talked by the senior leadership team. But it's not just tone at the top, it's also the mood in the middle is just as important, because if that tone at the top is failing to get down to the mood in the middle, the board and senior management need to know that. So again, the board asking the questions, are we getting the right information around that mood in the middle? And there's increasing technology that's available to be able to measure that. And this is what boards should be on top of.
Love it. I love it. The mood in the middle, which is often where we see the resistance to change as well, when we're trying to implement a whole range of different transformation and often what we think is quite innovative ways of doing things, but that mood in the middle is often the real sticking point. So managing risk, which is obviously one of our favourite topics on Risky Women, but also absolutely key for boards. And you've already mentioned this need to look beyond the sort of financial risks and take a proper 360-degree view of both, sort of your operational, your compliance risks. And it's obviously been highlighted in several reports from regulators. So how can boards and companies, I guess, ensure that they're being proactive and preemptive and not just reactive in managing some of those risks?
Yeah. Well, they've got to make sure that they've got the right information. And this is where integrated reporting comes in. I happen to sit on the board of the International Integrated Reporting Council. And while the integrated reports, the external reports are quite comprehensive and useful for investors, it's the integrated thinking that it generates internally, which is just as important. And what integrated reporting does is break that value of the company into 6 capitals. So that's the financial and the physical capital that most boards are familiar with and used to getting reports on. But it's the social capital, the environment capital, the human capital, and the intellectual capital that boards should be receiving information upon, because if we're talking about value creation, if they don't understand where the value is, what's going to impact the value of that both positively and negatively, they won't be on top of the risks that are facing that company. And so that's the way that they can be proactive, but they can't be proactive unless they're getting the correct information.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you share sort of changes that you've seen as well around the impact of diversity, or the, maybe the increasing diversity, hopefully, over the length of your career? You sort of mentioned that at the start.
It's changed significantly, and I do know people who work at Qantas now, and it is not this, has a completely different environment, and that was even when I was there. So that was a significant change. But with my work with boards over the last 25 years, we've seen the percentage of women on boards increase in Australia in the ASX 200 from less than 10% to have just hit 30%, which I think is a great achievement. And so I ask directors when I meet them, has this made a difference? And it has. And I think a lot of directors used to use the argument that, we only appoint by merit, and that's why we don't have any women on the board. Now the conversation is actually, we've now got 3 women on the board. It's actually changed the conversation to a better conversation, a more informed conversation. And I think some of those director dinosaurs who were very anti-targets or quotas have now sort of succession planned off those boards, which is good. So we're seeing much, I think, younger women coming on with different backgrounds. Some research that I did back in 2009 showed that 70% of non-executive directors were either CEOs or former executives of ASX 200 companies. Now, given the fact that I think even today that's still less than 10% women, you still just had the same type of person coming onto the board. So it's not just about gender diversity that we're seeing, it's about diversity of background and experience and skills that are coming to those boards. And based on the discussions that I've had, it has definitely improved discussion around the board table.
Well, fantastic to have a positive change and shift. That's great. Connecting, celebrating and championing women in risk regulation and compliance, Risky Women Radio takes an intimate look at the rants and revelations of the top women shaping the debate and the industry. So, on to our rants and revelations, which is one of my favourite sections of our Risky Women Radio podcast. So what's your top piece of advice that you've been given and that has really helped you and progress through your career?
Well, I'll never forget my first day of working after I graduated. I was living at home and I left to get the train to work, and my father said to me, my father had just retired, "I've never been involved in a dishonest transaction in my life." And I have always taken that, and that has, and I can say the same thing to my children now that they've finished university and working. And I've always had a really high ethical standard of what I do. And oftentimes, people might throw up ideas, and my view will be, don't lower your standards. Just don't lower your standards. And I think that has really helped me. I might have missed out on opportunities by not lowering my standards. I'm quite comfortable with that. And I will continue working with that level of ethics and honesty in what I do.
Love it. Don't lower your standards. I think that's one for everybody. And what's your rant? So, if we had ruler of the world, Pru Bennett, for the day, what's the one thing that you would change?
Some standardisation of reporting around E&S issues. It's what I would call a dog's breakfast. There are so many organisations out there, there's 200 plus, that have the solution to E&S reporting. You've got SASB, you've got GRI, you've got the reporting dialogue, you've got this and you've got that. I'd like them all to come together and all come to agreement. I think that will help companies with their reporting, because they used to ask me, do we use SASB? Do we use GRI? Do we use this? Do we do that? Investors struggle because they don't have consistency of data to be able to assess companies. And so if I could wave that magic wand, it would be some standardisation around ESG reporting, which will help both companies and investors.
Excellent. I think... well, let's hope your magic wand, works. Maybe the influence of Risky Women Radio, we can change the world. Risky Women is a vibrant network at the centre of a global community in a rapidly growing, evolving and influential industry. Given the continued pace of change, our rapid fire round revisits the most pressing topics to share ideas and offer listeners new perspectives. All right, the final rapid fire round. What is your prediction or what you think is the key trend for the year ahead?
Well, with COVID-19, who knows? Not so much a prediction, but a wish that it's not going to be as bad as what they're saying on the news today. How this is going to impact the world is such an unknown, and it's more of a wish than a prediction that it's not going to be as bad.
But we will all get really good at working remotely.
We'll get and those business continuity plans, will work.
Yes, exactly. So do you have a cure for the cost of compliance?
Two things: good systems, and secondly, to see a lot of what is called compliance as an opportunity. Too often I'm told about corporate governance is a compliance issue. It's not. It's a strategic issue. It can make your company better. It can distinguish your business and what you do from your competitors. So I think it should also be looked at as an opportunity as opposed to just simply compliance.
Excellent. We often say this, but risk and opportunity is the same word in Chinese, seen as, one side of the other side of the coin. So are you optimistic, pessimistic or neutral for your outlook in the year ahead?
That's a day-by-day thing in the current circumstances. I call myself an optimist, so I'm always pretty optimistic about what's going to happen. My other wish list is, as I said before, that this virus sorts itself out within the next month or 2 months or so, and then the world can get back to and possibly being a better place. So you say every time something like this happens, we learn, we do things better. So there could be some positives that come out of this.
So while we're all working from home, let's get your advice on what's a book that you recommend that everyone reads.
Oh, look, I'm a real reader of autobiographies, and I think the best one I read was Nelson Mandela, Walk to Freedom. I just found it absolutely fascinating about the patience and conviction of Nelson Mandela and what he did achieve at the time.
Yeah, amazing, man. Something to watch?
Oh, Billions. I'm a bit of a Billions fan. And I know the new series is just coming out, so I'll wait till all the episodes are out and I'll do a binge watch on that. Yeah, some people love it, some people hate it, but I'm a bit of a Billions fan.
Excellent. And what's your favourite podcast?
Oh, there's only one answer for that, Risky Women.
Oh, of course. Thank you very much, very much. Okay, well, it's been fantastic to have you join us, Pru Bennett. We could have spoken on so many of those topics in so much more detail, but brilliant insights, and thank you for being our risky woman.
Well, thank you very much, Kimberly.
Thank you for listening to this exciting episode of Risky Women Radio to connect, champion, and celebrate women in risk regulation and compliance. I'm Kimberly Cole, based in Hong Kong. For more information on the Risky Women Global Network, head to our website in the episode notes, and please be a part of the ongoing conversation by subscribing to this podcast, connecting with us at Risky Women on Twitter, or even reaching out to me directly by email.